Okay, good morning to everybody. Thank you for coming. And thank you in particular to Professor Reza Hasmath. I would like to introduce him. He is a full professor of political science at the University of Alberta and a Fulbright Research Chair in public diplomacy at the University of Southern California. He has previously held faculty positions in management, sociology, and political science at the Universities of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford. He has also worked for and advised global think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and social organizations. His award-winning research examines how the behavior of emerging Chinese state and non-state actors potentially affect salient theories, practices, and assumptions in international affairs. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Civil Society and is the foundation editor of the Routledge Research on the Politics and Sociology of China book series. And today, he is going to talk about how China currently views the world. After his presentation, we will open the floor, for the Q&A. So we would really appreciate if you can raise later some questions. So without further ado, please, Professor Hasmath, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mario, for your introduction, and welcome everyone. I know the term is about to end, so I really appreciate you being here in the last few days of the term. What I'm going to talk to you about today is something that it's really important for us to examine and understand. And so every day we there's a lot of controversies about China, particularly in the European Union and Western jurisdictions. There's a lot of tensions going on between these jurisdictions. And a lot of it has to do with misunderstandings. A lot of it has to do with lack of trust. A lot of it has to do with it's just simply we have different ways of doing things, perhaps. So what I'm going to talk about today is perhaps from a different perspective, understanding how everyday Chinese citizens think about the world. We seldom have a very good understanding about how everyday citizens think in any jurisdiction, whether it's our own jurisdictions or in China. But what's really interesting about it is we need to know about what they think because it gives you support. If you're a state, it gives you support for what you can and cannot do. Irrespective if it's China or here, you always need citizen support for your policies. So in many ways, it gives what I'm about to present gives you sort of an understanding of what citizens think about the world, what state policies are possible, or what support there is for current state policies. And it gives us a greater insight into how can we best engage with China? How can we do a better engagement with China that fulfills both our sort of interests, so to speak? So more formally, I mean, in this slide, I'm just suggesting to you that the relationship of the EU and with its many member states has been, fraught with tensions in the 2020s. Particularly during COVID, we saw there's less and less engagement. There was not a lot of diplomatic engagement with China. And so it's not surprising, post-COVID, we're seeing even greater misunderstandings and a lack of trust. Put differently, in the West, a lot of Western jurisdictions in the European Union, Germany, France, that's in this survey, US, Canada, Australia, which is also in the survey. When we engage with China, we often, there's an embedded sort of mistrust. And to give you proof of that, we can engage with Singapore, we can engage with South Korea, we can engage with Japan, which have many very similar configurations institutionally as China does. So bureaucratically, there's a corporate sort of environment in these states, but we trust them. And so because we trust them, we're more likely to have much more of a positive engagement with them. And so it has been fraught with tensions, particularly as China's rising as an economic, social, and political power. We see that there are a lot of tensions in the international landscape between Western jurisdictions and the European and China. And as I mentioned, the state's capacity, any state's capacity, inclusive of China's ability to pursue its own interests, must have popular legitimacy. It must have the citizens' support. So this basically means the general public support or dissatisfaction with China's foreign policy. It can be translated into future support or dissatisfaction with the Communist Party of China and the state itself. So what I ended up doing is there's been 3 iterations of the Chinese Citizens Global Perception Survey. I started this last year, so we ran it in 2023, 2024, and currently running it as I speak. So the newest results will come out at the end of this month. And what I ended up doing is just doing two types of survey, two types of methodologies for the survey. I'm not going to talk to you a lot about methodology, I promise you, but it's important because people often ask, can we rely on this information? Is this worthwhile for us to even gather this? So it's twofold kind of methodologies: a telephone survey as well as an internet survey. The telephone survey is really important because it allows us to access populations like the rural population or hidden populations that we normally would not be able to access. So it's a nationally representative survey. It's looking at citizens' perspectives of Australia, Canada, the EU, France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, the UK, and the US. Um, what's interesting for this conversation is how the EU as a whole contrasts to France and Germany. So it'd be really interesting to see all those contrasts, and there's many contrasts. Um, there were 33 surveys, and there were Likert scales. So it's just basically asking people from a scale from 1 to 7 what their beliefs are, what their thoughts are. So what I'm about to do now is give you a few kind of perspectives. I'm going to first give you the general global perception that citizens have of the world. Well, this shouldn't be surprising. Chinese citizens strongly indicate that they see China as the most powerful nation. So 2/3 of respondents said China is the most powerful nation. And that kind of makes sense. There's a lot of nationalistic pride. Mind you, this is not objective power. This is perceptual power. This is what people perceive. So when we ask who has the most influence in the world, China number one. Number two, the United States. Now, this is not surprising to anyone here, right? We got China, we got the US, followed by Russia. And this is where it becomes interesting. Because what you're going to see throughout our survey here is that Russia plays quite prominently throughout the respondents' sort of beliefs and attitudes. And so I'm going to, I mean, last year it came up and we thought that has to be a blip. It has to be an anomaly. Because, there's a lot of tensions. I mean, there's the Russia-Ukraine conflict. China has been backing Russia in many ways. And so maybe there's a blimp here. Maybe it's an anomaly. Maybe it's happening only once. But then it happened again in the next version of the survey, where Russia became quite prominent. So I had to explain it, and I'll explain it a bit later onwards, why Russia plays such a prominent role. So first and foremost, China's most powerful, followed by the United States. Russia's number 3, and then there's a drop to the EU at number 4. In comparison, we can see France and Germany are not seen as very influential. So citizens do see the EU as being a much more influential actor than France and Germany. Not sure if you can actually see it. It might be a bit hazy on there, but I'd be happy to give you the slides afterwards if you want to see the actual figures themselves. Another thing we ask is trust. So as I kind of hinted beforehand, you need to have trust if you're going to engage with anyone. At an individual level, you need to have trust with your next door neighbor. You need to have trust with your partner if you're going to engage with them. Otherwise, you need to have trust in your employer or employee relationships. In any sort of relationship, you need trust, minimum levels of trust. And at the international realm, you also need that as well. So if Spain wants to engage with China, Spain needs to have minimum levels of trust in China and vice versa to engage with each other. It doesn't matter what they're engaged with, there has to be minimum levels of trust. So we ask citizens, who do you trust? Which global partners, which jurisdictions do you trust? So again, despite the continuation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, citizens perceive China as being the most trustworthy actor. So they trust Russia the most. If you are schooled in Chinese history or even modern Chinese history, you would understand why Japan was scoring the lowest. It's just historical relations has been quite fraught. It's been quite tense, particularly in the last century. So citizens do not trust Japan very much. The second sort of lowest trust levels was the United States. They do not trust the United States. Now, let me pause here. Imagine if you're the United States and you're trying to engage with China and vice versa. If there's a lack of trust between both sides, it's really difficult to engage in any fruitful engagement. And if you look at polls in the United States, this is obviously not the conversation I'm having today, but it's worthwhile seeing the reverse. In the United States, there's a low levels of trust in China as well. So both Chinese citizens do not trust the US, and US citizens do not trust China. Now, there aren't that many polls in Europe, which looks at how much trust there is with China or actors akin to that. But based on media, based on popular opinions that might be espoused through media, both social media and traditional media, there's also a lack of trust with China. So, this can be very disturbing if there's low levels of trust. Um, More acutely, we see party members, high income earners, highly educated respondents were more likely to express a higher trust in the United States. And perhaps they have more meaningful awareness of the United States. Let me put it to you in a different way. Ask yourselves, why do we not trust China? And often what it comes down to is the idea that we don't really understand China very much. We might think communist, even though really it's, in many, many ways, it's not really your classic communist country. It's perhaps more capitalistic than communistic for the most part. We may not understand why the state plays a role in private enterprise, or the state plays a role in civil society. It has a very different configuration than in our societies, where in our societies, at least in theory, we want a separation between the state, market, and civil society. I mean, that's what Western history and Western philosophies have evolved into. In China, that's a different sort of reality. And a lot of East Asian jurisdictions, is a different reality where the state plays a role in the market and so society. I mean, it's a long-winded way of saying to you, we don't quite fully understand China. We don't have a very good competency fully of China. So everyday citizens tend not to trust China because it looks different. So it's also equally the case in China. We see, and I'll give you another slide where we're comparing if you have a knowledge of a society, how does it relate to trust? And lo and behold, I'll give you a preview. The more knowledge you have of society, the more likely you are to trust a society. The only exceptions are the United States. So I'll get to that in a moment. But at least we see here that who Chinese citizens trust. They trust Russia. And again, I'll explain that to you in a moment. Um, Long-term importance to China. Russia, again. Russia is viewed as the most important jurisdiction to China's long-term future. Now, this is interesting because you might ask yourself, well, is it because Russia's challenging Western sort of doctrines and Russia's standing up to the West? That plays a role, but it's also economic reasons. As Western jurisdictions removed itself from Russia, it gave greater market opportunities to Chinese businesses and firms to enter Russia even more so. So there's great market opportunity to enter Russia if you're the Chinese because Western businesses just remove themselves from there. Um, and there's a close ties historically as well. It gets a bit more complicated why Chinese citizens see Russia as an important actor. You have to break it down. So young people, particularly young youths, they love the idea that Russia is standing up to the West. They love the idea that there can be a bipolar world again or a multipolar world again. Um, Often I'm struck, not only with my students, but with people who don't seem to realize that it's only in 1989, afterwards, after the fall of the Cold War, did we have a unipolar world where we have ideas that we saw as universal, whereas that was never the case generally. If we go back to the Cold War in most of human history, there's always been different doctrines, different ideologies that's been dominant globally and even competing. So we're kind of moving back to that sort of bipolar, multipolar world, so to speak. And young people in China love the idea that there is more than one ways of seeing, of doing things, perhaps. More than one ways of seeing. There's a sort of a philosophy out there that's a current ideology we can subscribe to. So they see Russia as standing up to that sort of alternative philosophy, shall we say. But for the most part, I would say there's a pragmatic reason. It is because there are great markets in Russia. There's money to be had. So it makes sense that citizens do see opportunities there. Now, in the next slide, for those of you who are more international security bent, have more of an international security bent, the question we ask is, where do you see a conflict occurring, a military conflict occurring in the next decade? Now, despite tensions and ongoing border disputes between China and India, half of respondents don't believe a conflict between India and China is likely. So they don't really see that as a major issue. In fact, the possibility of a military conflict with the European Union is not even seen as it's quite unlikely in the next decade. Where they do see tensions, it's with the United States. And I'll give you an example of this. In one of my future slides, I'm going to talk to you about Taiwan. I'm going to talk to you about how do citizens see the conflict in Taiwan. And for the most part, Chinese citizens do see a path forward where there can be some sort of compromise with Taiwan, a peaceful compromise. But if the United States is involved, they see that it's more likely to involve a military conflict. So you do see that there's some tensions here. Um, so there's a lack of trust of the United States. They see them as a rival, and they see the United States as a possibility in which there's a good chance to have a military conflict in the next decade. And they do see this as an inevitable sort of outcome in the next decade. So it's interesting to see how citizens perceive that. Um, I guess I'll ask there'll be Q&As afterwards if you want me to clarify anything. Um, at this stage, I want to just move on to another sort of set of questions that we asked. And the questions we're asking is, where should China have a leadership role? What sort of global roles should China have? Um, and interestingly enough, citizens see China should have a greater peacekeeping role. So China should play a greater role in conflicts around the world. So number one, first and foremost, is peacekeeping. It's seen as a key priority for its citizens. This is followed by technology. So China should export its technologies globally. So the technologies sort of aspect is quite interesting because the state is supporting this, and this is where we see most tensions occurring. So we see a lot of tensions in the West. If we look at, Huawei is a great example of that. If we look at any of the mobile technologies or 5G technologies, we see chips. We see that in many aspects of the technological realm, there's a lot of distrust of China and a lot of wariness with Chinese technology firms. But citizens support this. Chinese citizens want China to export their technologies overseas. With peacekeeping, it's interesting because it tells us that citizens want China to play a greater role globally in global conflicts, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's Ukraine, Russia. They want to see China playing a greater role in resolving many of these conflicts or involved in these, in playing a role, in engaged in these conflicts to Chinese interests, mind you. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, at face value, that seems wonderful because if we can have more actors involved in which can reduce tensions or can eliminate conflicts, that's wonderful. The problem at hand, particularly if you're a Western jurisdiction like Spain or the European Union, is that Chinese versions of peacekeeping might be slightly different than our versions of peacekeeping. It might involve commercial interests. It might involve things that might be have different sort of norms and values embedded within that sort of peacekeeping resolution than the way we practice it. Put in the most simplest way, if the Chinese are peacekeeping and we're peacekeeping and we have different ideas of what peacekeeping is, it can create conflict, especially if we don't trust China. So that's the sort of implications I'm discussing here. But at the very least, what our survey shows is that citizens support this. We also see the Chinese are actually increasing their military budgets. We saw that in the last year's budget. We see this in the future budgets that's projected. And so a lot of it can be geared towards peacekeeping and geared towards where Chinese interests are globally. Put differently, this is just simply saying China's behaving like many other powers do. They are trying to maintain its own interests. It's trying to maintain its own interests through international kind of activities, peacekeeping, perhaps trade, technology, um, and and so it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. If China does this, doesn't mean we're going to lose out. But in many calculations we see in policy circles, it has that sort of realm where if China does this, we're going to lose out, and if we lose out, China, we should be very wary of China, so to speak. So this is the leadership roles. Another sort of question we ask is about cooperation. Um, there's been a lot of conversations in Spain and Germany and France, in many Western jurisdictions, about whether or not we should continue to engage with China. Should we decouple from China? Should we de-risk from China? And this is particularly in the technological realm. Now, let's ask the question in China, do Chinese citizens want to de-risk or decouple from the West? The answer is no. In fact, there's a greater willingness, an overwhelming willingness to engage with the Western jurisdictions. So Chinese citizens want to have greater economic relations, economic cooperation with the West, with the Western jurisdictions in the survey. They also want to have greater cooperation in technology and research sectors. So there's a willingness on their end to cooperate with us. It may not be reciprocal, whereby we may not trust them as much to have these levels of cooperation. And so this gives you sort of a leeway into how much engagement we can have with China. Another question we ask is attitudes towards China's global engagement. So again, remember these are Likert scales, so scales from 1 to 7. So we asked respondents a few questions about whether they strongly agree or strongly disagree with a few statements. Um, Basically, China should concentrate more on domestic affairs than on global matters. Most people believe China should be more inward looking in many respects. Um, should China export its own model, its political and economic model? Citizens do not want that. They do not want China to export its model overseas. But what they do want, again, is Chinese increased global military presence in order to further improve China's national security. So this is something that plays up to a lot of the conversations we've been having about international security, where citizens want China to have a greater role globally in that realm. Um, Let me say a few words about tourism, study, work, and immigration. It's going to be very quick. Where do citizens want to visit? Um, we see that France is still the #1 global destination for Chinese citizens. For studying, we see the United Kingdom plays a great role, Germany as well. For working, um, Russia's there. uh, and again, if you've lived in China for many years and you're engaged contemporarily in China, you might think something's wrong here. This does not make any sense at all. And you have to be skeptical. I'm super skeptical about it as well. Um, Again, it's a pragmatism there, right? Western firms have left. There's still a market for these goods and services. And if the Chinese can provide that, it makes perfect sense for them to do so. So I think this is why we see working playing such a role. Immigration, it seems more and more Chinese citizens do not want to immigrate outside of China as much. But if they were to immigrate, we do see um, that Germany is there, Australia is there to some extent, less so the United States. So we do see a shift in immigration patterns as well. Again, unless you're a specialist in this, or you're curious about this, this is great for public affairs counselors who are interested in knowing how can they market their countries. I'll give you some insights into how to actually influence China in a moment, because there are ways in which you can influence all of this. We tend to think we can't influence China, but we can, and there's some refined ways we can do so. Which brings me to my next slides, sources and knowledge of global jurisdictions. Where do citizens get their information from? How do they see the world? Like, how do they get information to perceive the world the way they perceive it? In other words, where do they get the information to have the idea they should trust Russia? Where do they get the information to say, hey, the United States might be the country we have the most potential conflict with? So, first and foremost, as I mentioned beforehand, there's a relationship between knowledge of a country and trust in the country. And this is even at, from a sociological standpoint, we do see this as well. The more engagement you have with someone, you're more likely to trust them more. So I'll give you an example. I borrowed this from ethnic studies, where I do a lot of work. So my family's from Trinidad in the Caribbean, and I grew up in Toronto. So there's a big Caribbean population in Toronto. If you interact with the Caribbean population in Toronto, you're more likely to trust the Caribbean population in Toronto. So the more we engage with each other, you're more likely to have meaningful trust. Again, this happens at the international realm as well. So the more knowledge you have, the more likely you are to trust the jurisdiction. You may not be able to see it here, but I ran a few regressions there, which gives you proof to the idea that there's a strong relationship between knowledge of a jurisdiction and trust in that jurisdiction. The only anomaly is the United States. So there's always anomalies when you run these kinds of tests. The United States is the entity that people are knowledgeable about, but they don't trust them. But everyone else, they're more likely to trust. Now, interestingly enough, excuse me, there's a lack of knowledge about Europe. is a lack of knowledge about Canada and Australia. Citizens of course, they might know the geography of the country, they may know the geography of the location, but they know very little about the country or the European Union as a whole. Um, and if they know very little, they're less likely to trust the entity. So this is very low-hanging fruit solutions you can find policymakers doing. These are conversations I've had with embassies in Beijing, where public relations and public affairs needs to, increase their presence in, particularly in the rural areas, particularly in the Western provinces, where there's greater awareness of your country. Um, I'll give you another example. One of my first jobs was with the embassy in Canada, in Australia, where I was a public affairs officer. And I was tasked to try and figure out what is Australia's perception of Canada. Mind you, this is 2.5 decades ago. And what we found out is that Australians thought Canada is like Australia, except we're not technologically advanced. And that was an affront to us. It's like, how could we not be seen as technologically advanced, particularly in Australia? And what we found out was we need to do a better job in our public affairs. We need to market Canada better in Australia. And often we also found out there's a lag. What your perception of a country is usually a few years lag of what the actual reality in the country is right now. So put differently, if Canada is technologically advanced now, it might take a few years for citizens in another country to figure out they're technologically advanced. For the sake of this exercise, that tells us the sort of knowledge that people have of the country. It's often a reflection of many years ago. It's probably 5 to 7 years ago of how they see the country. So there's always a lag. Nevertheless, if you are a counselor, if you are doing work in China, if you're a nation, you do need to improve your brand in China. So there's greater awareness of the country. And so this might come back to the idea of what goods and services that Spain can offer, what goods and services Germany can offer and France can offer in a meaningful way. And you find when that happens, there's greater trust with the country. And if there's greater trust, it's more likely to have better engagement with the country. Now, I'll give you even more refined ways, what avenues you can use to actually influence the population. And this is where again, I apologize for the chart there, can actually show you. So basically, this chart is saying this. Where do citizens get their information from? Is it traditional media? So is it newspapers? Is it television? Is it radio? Or is it social media? Or is it through personal discussion? Most citizens get their information, doesn't matter what generation they are, doesn't matter what age they are, rather, doesn't matter what gender, doesn't matter what socioeconomic background, doesn't matter what rural, urban, doesn't matter what location in China. They get most of their information through social media. Now, let me pause here and suggest why that's so important and interesting for us. Traditional media, radio, television, newspapers, are much more controlled in China than social media. So I'll give you an extent to this. If you're running a television program, if you're running a radio program, or if you're a newspaper editor, generally speaking, you get guidelines from the party about what are some aspects you may not be able to discuss or can discuss, some sort of things you might want to bend towards. So there's guidelines that's given in a direct fashion. In a different way, that suggests that the party is able to give much more directions through traditional media, and they can control narratives in that fashion. Social media, on the other hand, is a bit more difficult to control. There is, of course, levels of control on social media, but relative to traditional media, it's much more difficult to control social media. So the party's messaging is much more difficult to be delivered through social media than it is through traditional. Now, if citizens are viewing the world mostly through their social media, sort of posts and so forth, that tells you that if you're a foreign entity, you can influence their perceptions through social media without as much control that might be seen in traditional media. So that tells us in many respects, we can influence how citizens in China perceive the world through this mechanism. Again, it's super important for us to realize, and this is what this chart shows, irrespective of age, education, income, location, employment status, any of the demographic variables we ran, citizens overwhelmingly get their views about the world through social media. And as such, it's in our interest, if we want to influence the Chinese public, we also influence social media. And we are able to do so. It is quite possible to do so, much more so than through traditional ones. Um, so let me tell you a few more words about some of these implications. I'll talk about some of these conflicts, and then we can open up to discussion and Q&As. I mentioned, and I promised you, I'm going to try and explain the Russia effect because it didn't pass the sort of tests, the everyday test. In other words, I was like, why is Russia there? Why is Russia so prominent? It makes very little sense to us, other than it's a blimp, other than it's fashionable. But if we dig deeper, this has been going on for quite some time, even prior to these surveys, where there's been a greater cozying up to Russia. Um, so it's plausible that citizens' perception of Russia is influenced by a preference orientation that's elastic. And let me say what I mean by that. In other studies, I looked at citizens' ideology, citizens' policy preferences, or their preferences for how the state should be run. What's interesting is that it's elastic. It can be influenced very easily. All societies have this, mind you. If I run this in the United States, I've run it here, you would find that your own ideas about how the state should run, what policies you should do, what ideology you have, it's elastic. In other words, it could be a range. There's a range that you have. And in many ways, I could actually influence which sort of ideology based on that range that you have. And China is no exception to this. So we see citizens can be influenced by their preference orientation. In other words, there can be big swings very quickly. If the Chinese state was to ramp up information about that's very pro-Russia, you would find citizens would be even more trusting Russia, and vice versa. But there's a range. What I'm suggesting to you now is that the state has not done that, and then we're now establishing a range in which there's a preference for Russia, and it's overly positive. So how do you explain this? Well, citizens self-reported Russia has a significant impact. There's greater awareness of Russia. And this is across demographics. There's a greater awareness of the Russian society, a greater awareness of Russian ways of doing things. And so, in fact, citizens who receive more of their information on television and social media are more likely to trust Russia, while those who rely on radio are less likely to trust Russia, but even still, they trust Russia. Gender plays a role. Females tend to display less trust in Russia than males, so males tend to trust Russia. Location, party membership, education does not have a statistically significant impact. So if we were to break this down, a lot of it has to do with generational variances. So young people in particular, they are attracted to the idea that Russia is standing up to the West and there's alternatives. Much older cohorts, more economically wealthier cohorts, love the idea that there's market opportunities in Russia. And so that partially explains the Russia effect. What will be super interesting is when we're running the survey now, if Russia plays prominently, and I suspect it will. And I suspect this is a reality we're going to see for quite some time, where China and Russia has a closer sort of trusting relationship. This is where I mentioned that the China-Taiwan reunification. Citizens want a diplomatic solution with Taiwan. That doesn't mean they want Taiwan. Well, it doesn't mean that it's a two-state solution or a one-state solution here. It just means they want a diplomatic solution. And 2/3 want a diplomatic solution. If the U.S. is involved, they change the reality. If the U.S. is involved, they're less supportive, and they're more likely to support a military solution to Taiwan. So it's quite interesting what that tells us. For this iteration of the survey, I ran it just before the Taiwan elections and right after the Taiwan elections to see if there's any changes in how citizens see it. There were none. So citizens are quite consistent in wanting a diplomatic solution with Taiwan, but they do not want the United States to be involved. So it's quite interesting from that standpoint. But Russia, Ukraine, citizens are quite ambivalent about the conflict, generally speaking. And they identify Russia losing strength during this conflict, which of course it's to the benefit of China because it gives China a greater sort of influence over Russia and greater sway over Russia and more market opportunities in Russia. There is support for China playing an active role in resolving the conflict, and it tends to be highest among middle income and less educated respondents. Respondents who believe China's interests have been affected by the conflict are more likely to support China playing an active role in resolving the conflict. And again, females tend to be less supportive of Chinese influence in the conflict. And this is, I mean, historically and over jurisdictions, we see males tend to be more supportive of conflicts than females are. So that's just to put that into context there. Israel-Palestine, half the population wants China to play a role in the Israel-Palestine conflict and resolving that. The other half does not. Citizens who see China wanting to be a global leader in peace and security express a greater interest in China playing an active role in resolving this conflict. Again, females are less likely to support this. And the sources of information here do not play a role in terms of their attitudes towards resolving this conflict. So my final words, I mean, in many respects, what it is about how do we develop greater minimum levels of trust with China? What this tells us, what the surveys in whole tells us, is that there is a lack of trust that is deterring our ability to engage with China. It's particularly with the United States, there's a lack of trust. And if that cannot be overcome, that could be detrimental to everyone. So there has to be an increased understanding of China in the West. And I would even say conversely, in China, there has to be a greater awareness and understanding of Western jurisdictions. In order to foster this, we need more cultural connections. We need more people-to-people interactions. So we don't only need, and this is another way of saying to you, we don't only need state-to-state interactions between China and Spain, for example. What we need is social organizations, universities, influential individuals, businesses interacting with the exact same cohort in China. We need more people-to-people exchanges. And this is how you get this sort of bottom-up sort of trust, that meaningful engagement from that sort of level. Because at the state-to-state level, it doesn't necessarily translate down to the everyday citizen. It takes time for it to translate, if anything. So we need greater people-to-people ties and cultural connections with China, and vice versa. And you would find over time, there'd be greater minimum levels of trust in order to engage with each other. This is not to say China should be our best friend. This is not to say that we need to be the best partners with China, but we need to have minimum levels of trust in order to engage with China. And I think for the rest of this decade, this is what a lot of Western jurisdictions should try to promote, is greater connections with China rather than the opposite, which is trying to be more antagonistic towards China. It's to our detriment, and it's to their detriment as well. So let me end it with that comment, and if there's any questions or comments, I'll be happy to entertain them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reza, for a very stimulating presentation. I don't know if any of you would like to raise a question now, or otherwise I can break the ice, maybe. I actually have a few questions myself. The first, I know you mentioned that you don't want to talk much about the methodology, but I'm super interested in some issues related with that, and I guess that maybe also most of them might be interested in all the formalities, all the procedures you have to endure, to be able to conduct this kind of survey in China, particularly nowadays, right? So how's your interactions with which institutions, the partners there, So I'm sure there's a lot of history, behind that. There are the stories to share. So maybe that could be the first question. Yeah.
So that's the most common question I'm asked about the methodology. So I'm happy to talk about methodology. I just didn't want to bore you because I have a whole paper talking about the methodology here. I could go on forever about this. So first and foremost, let's be very clear. It's very hard to do social research in China. It's very difficult to do quantitative or qualitative research, and particularly present day. So for those of you in this audience who are their students or academics, you'll encounter this reality. So here's my sort of personal biography. I started in China in the late 90s. And I started working with the National Bureau of Statistics, collecting ethnicity data. So I've always worked on very sensitive issues. So I started off with ethnic work. And the National Bureau of Statistics would collect ethnic data in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in a lot of the Western provinces. So for the last 2 decades and a bit, I've been working with them. I'm a trusted actor, so to speak. And I've utilized those relationships to, do more surveys. And you would see if you go to the website of this particular survey, more of a greater detail about the methodology. But if you also go to my website, you'll see all the surveys I've done in the past. And a lot of it has to do with a trusted actor. A lot of it also has to do with understanding their hidden rules in China to do social research. There's hidden rules in many different aspects in China, but in survey work particularly, I would not publish this in Chinese. I wouldn't talk about this in China domestically. Um, and so that's a sort of a hidden rule. No one told me I should do this, but it's a hidden rule to ensure that you're not giving increased public attention domestically in China, then that would raise attention to this sort of work. And again, being a trusted actor. So they, excuse me, so the surveyors I work with are quite aware that I've never embarrassed the state domestically. Sorry, my throat's a bit sore. I wouldn't embarrass the state domestically. I would give the information as what it is and let you guys determine how to interpret it. So I think that's learned from doing work on civil societies. I went from ethnic data, ethnic research, to looking at civil society, another sensitive topic. So when I came to this was not that sensitive. I was like, thank goodness, I don't have to do sensitive work as much. So it's understanding the hidden rules, understanding being trusted partners. Interestingly enough, we had to change some of my partners for this iteration because some of the questions we asked about Taiwan, it's a little sensitive. How about citizens think about some other questions you'll see on the website, kind of a bit sensitive. And no one told us this particular surveyor we shouldn't, but they're like, maybe it's a gray area. So we had to move to another surveyor. So there's this survey's done in twofold. Again, it's online and it's also done through telephone. So I do multiple partners around the same time, and we triangulate the data to make sure it's accurate. We use a lot of academic methodologies to ensure that the data, when we test the data, we make sure the survey responses are accurate. For the online stuff, we can actually figure out how long it takes you to answer something, right? So we know how long it takes you to do your keystroke. So we can know if people are just doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, you can figure out, there's some methodological approaches you can take to figure out how accurate it is. These are random surveys. It's on a panel data if anyone's interested in that stuff. So I can't go back to the same people year on, year on. It's more of a, we look at clusters, census clusters and try to figure it out methodologically. The last thing I'll mention, I mean, I can talk about methodology all day. We can do weights. This is unweighted, but if I add weights means you're trying to ensure it's you're mirroring the population in terms of age and gender, income, and stuff like that. So it can be weighted or unweighted. Because we're doing purposeful sampling, we are able to actually achieve a similar range to the national population. But we also do weights to just make sure it doesn't change the responses and it doesn't really meaningfully change the responses. So, we are quite, we believe the data is quite accurate in that respect, at least at an academic standard. Yeah.
I would like just really to tell us which are the tools that can use that an embassy can use to improve the perception of a country.
That's a lovely question. And in fact, I can spend a whole presentation on this, which I've done. I'll give you 2 ways. First is, often if you're an embassy and you're a political affairs officer or a public relations officer or whatever position you hold, you're just happy that you can engage with the Chinese state. I'll be very frank. It's really hard to engage with them. It's become more and more difficult to engage with your counterparts in Beijing or in the local jurisdiction you're in China. So often you are limited to that formal exchange. There are 2 ways. One way is, that's a hit and miss. And in fact, you're duplicating, in many respects, the same information because you're going through official state sources. There are policy entrepreneurs in China. A whole host of papers which looks at the policy entrepreneur, those who are brokers, so to speak. There are think tanks in China, both internal and external, but the more influential ones are government-operated think tanks. So these are, at a high level, these policymakers on the Chinese side do influence policy. I have another paper which illustrates how these think tanks actually influence government policy. We use machine learning to try and figure out, we had about 1.5 million documents over the last 15, 20 years, 17, 18 years, sorry. And we figured out how do these think tanks actually influence policy at the government level? And they do. So identifying influential think tanks is one way you can change public perception from a top level. From another level, this is where there's a gray area for embassies because technically speaking, they're not allowed to directly influence the affairs of a state. That does not mean they can't fund a social organization or fund entities who can perhaps, provide cultural exchanges, shall we say, influence the state. So the second level is through social media. I'll give you an example. Canada used to have a Canada Fund in Beijing, where we would fund social organizations that promote our norms and values, shall we say. And one of the best ways to influence it is through social media, having those organizations have a social media presence to change the perceptions of the country. Tourism marketing is great for that standpoint. It's encouraging more exchanges. As if citizens from China visit Canada or visit Spain, that's a great cultural exchange as well. Having university to university exchanges, encouraging that. That's another way embassies can do so. It's become much more difficult now, at least for the countries that China does not trust, i.e. Canada, the United States. But with Spain and Germany, there's a greater levels of trust, relatively speaking. And so you can find embassies can encourage those exchanges more so, both formally and informally. Student-to-student exchange is one of the best ways as well. So there's many myriads of ways that an embassy can do that. But I think the most, other than public diplomacy, which is the latter aspect I was talking about, the former, i.e. identifying policy brokers, policy entrepreneurs in think tanks, and even influential business people, having engagements with them. That's one of the best ways you can actually influence China. It's actually, again, methodologically, it's the best way you can do so. Otherwise, it's a hit and miss. And often what we find embassy staff is trying to improve their Rolodex, improve their contacts as much as possible, without realizing they might be replicating the same levels of influence. So understanding who the brokers are, that's one of the best ways to do so.
I wonder if in the surveys, does it ever appear North Korea as a relationship in trust or in possibility of a conflict near future?
With China, that is.
With China.
Yeah. So in the survey, we don't ask any questions about North Korea. But having spent time in North Korea, Canadians are allowed to go. Yeah, I'm not American. There is close relations, of course. There's even military relations. So there is trust. There's also a Korean population in China. And you do find there is a strong levels of trust with the population there. You'd be quite surprised, however, there isn't as much awareness of North Korea in China in the most part. But as I said, the surveys is not actually touching that. It's drawing from other work that I've done. Yeah.
You've mentioned there's a difference between Chinese perception of peacekeeping and the Western one.
Yeah.
Can you expand a bit on those differences?
Sure. That's a great question. So when we think of peacekeeping, our traditional idea is that you might have a UN mandate, or you might have a NATO mandate, or and you're in a buffer zone, and that's where you are. But peacekeeping also involves peace building. And so for the traditional idea of peacekeeping, there might be Chinese troops, there might be a Chinese regiment, and they might work hand in hand with a UN entity or the like, and that's your traditional aspects. Where I think there's potential for disagreement or conflict is when you talk about peace building. Peace building involves infrastructure building, it involves institutional building, it involves many of the aspects that we often take for granted as universal, but it's not. So in terms of infrastructure building, Chinese state-owned enterprises, Chinese companies, Chinese military might want to have the contracts for peace, for building up infrastructure, particularly critical infrastructures, roads, transport, ports. This is part of peace building. And so if the Chinese do so, they're not doing so out of altruism. They're doing so because they do see in the long term this can lead to greater commercial interests that's enhanced. And so Western countries, when they do development, they also do the same thing for peace building. And so if you have one entity that has their own interests in mind, another entity with their own interests in mind, it's bound to have conflict. So it's in the peace building sort of aspect of peacekeeping, I think that's where you're bound to see variations. It's also a different style of peacekeeping. And I'll give you an example of this. Many years ago, we tried to understand what happens when a Chinese social organization goes to Africa, for example. Do they export what they learned in China to those countries? So we went to Ethiopia, went to Zimbabwe, went to Malawi, and Kenya. These are countries that have different political systems. So we thought maybe where China does work in, say, Zimbabwe, which has a similar political system as China, in a little respect, it'd be easier. So maybe that can be China might have a better role in similar political systems in that sort of effort. Where this translates to peacekeeping might suggest China might have a better role in these countries where they're semi-authoritarian or semi sort of have similar institutional structures. It didn't matter. It did not matter at all. In fact, the local population did not trust China. So this is a long-winded way of saying to you, peacekeeping involves trust, ultimately. It involves trust with the actor. It involves, if we see the UN emblem, we might trust the UN emblem, or we may not. If we see the US flag, we might trust them, or we may not, on their patches. If we see the Chinese one, we may not trust them. So at the nitty-gritty of peacekeeping operations, the local population needs to trust the actor. What we found in our work in Africa is that the local population did not trust them. And so this could be translatable into the work in peacekeeping. Mind you, this is still new. So we don't have a lot of studies looking at peacekeepers. If there are any students out there thinking about doing work on this, would be a great sort of gap in the literature or gap in knowledge for policymakers. But I would surmise that there will be a potential variation because citizens might think, why are you here? And they might be not very trusting of that.
Okay, I have another question myself.
Sure.
You know, at the end of your presentation, you focus on specific issues like Taiwan, Gaza, and so on and so forth. And then you elaborate a little bit on how some socioeconomic variables, have some influence, on the results. So my question is, could you elaborate a little bit if some of those variables like sex, rural, urban, whatever, income, whatever, have like more systematic effect on the whole of the results or not? Or I don't know.
Yeah. So the most systematic effect is actually gender, and I mentioned it beforehand. Females are less supportive. They're more inward looking. They want China to actually be more domestically oriented rather than globally oriented. Less likely to engage in conflict. Less likely to engage in peacekeeping. So there's more of an inward looking. Males tend to want the opposite, it seems, for the most part, if it was to generalize. So gender plays a greater role. Income and education. It seems that the more higher education, the more likely they have greater knowledge of the jurisdiction. So, I mean, there's a correlation there. It doesn't mean it causes it. If you're more educated, you're going to have greater knowledge. But there's still a correlation there that's worth exploring a bit more. In terms of income preferences, people who have higher incomes tend to want to have a greater engagement with Russia. And that could be that economic argument I've been talking about, that as the West withdraws from Russia, or has withdrawn from Russia, rather, Chinese citizens see greater market opportunities in Russia. And you would surmise this conflict's not going to go on forever. It might end very soon, actually. There might be sort of a peace brokered, hopefully within the year. And so there's going to be a post-conflict sort of reality where China has a greater upper hand. And so it makes perfect sense in the last couple of years, we see Chinese citizens seeing Russia and particularly those with higher incomes, those working as they own their own businesses, they're more likely to see Russia as a destination of choice versus others most immediately.
Okay, so if we don't have more questions, we can finish now. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.